One of the funny things you realize as you get older is that the whole story is never defined only by what you do. How you do it, and especially when you do it, can sometimes be more important than the what. Sure, you've got to aim at the right targets, but there are also better and worse times to launch your attack. This is familiar to crypto people who've been through a cycle or two. No matter what you do or what you launch, that number is more likely to go up rapidly during a bull cycle. Timing is equally important when it comes to the acceptance of difficult propositions. That's something that Cardano's been grappling with lately. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss this whole timing component in this contingent staking debate, discussion, whatever you want to call it. I honestly think it may be the wrong time for us to be having this discussion, but it seems to be engrossing everyone in the entire Cardano ecosystem. So we're going to do it today. If you're worried about this guy's ability to actually tell the time because his watch face just seems to have a bunch of random scribbles and about 17 different hour markings, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Guys, I really hope this is the last time we have to talk about contingent staking. But I know that's not actually true. I think the contingent staking discussion is probably going to go on for a long time. It's going to be this ongoing conversation, just like decentralization, just like multi-stake pool operators. It's going to go on and on and on. It's going to take a while until certain things happen. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. This isn't going to be one of those rambling whiteboard videos where people just make random lists of words that may or may not ever be connected in the video. We're going to use the whiteboard here for a very specific reason, and that's to graphically depict a couple of related timelines. I think that's the element that's kind of been missing from this chaotic debate so far, and the reason why it's been non-optimal. I think the debate has been like non-optimal so far. It's probably been a little bit too much emotion and passion, and maybe a little bit too little civil discourse. So we're going to talk about this timing issue, and it's going to require us having a couple timelines up here. So let's draw those timelines right now. So these are probably not going to be parallel. They probably will not be perfectly the same length. So forgive me in advance for those egregious mistakes, which I am bound to make. Okay, we got a couple of lines. At a certain point on this line, we're going to have something important happen, and that's going to be Voltaire. Voltaire right there. Okay, I'm going to try to use the stylus here and draw a V. Okay, that is Voltaire. We know the contingent staking has to happen after Voltaire because Voltaire comes in with SIP 1694, which I covered in detail on this channel. Go back and you'll find a video pretty recently, just a few weeks ago, a couple months ago. You'll find a video recently though that covered every minute detail of SIP 1694. Okay, maybe not every single detail, but a lot of detail. It was a very detailed rundown of everything in SIP 1694. So if you don't understand what happens with Voltaire, go back and watch that video, and it'll explain to you exactly how Voltaire is going to work, at least under that SIP. But we know that the voting for any kind of contingent staking has to happen after Voltaire because Voltaire lays out the framework for that voting to take place. So the big question here is, what happens when we have that vote? And importantly, when does that vote take place? So the people who are kind of in favor of contingent staking, so I think I think some of those people at least would like for a contingent staking vote to happen somewhere more in the near term, because of what they think happens after contingent staking. So let's say contingent staking happens right here. We've got contingent staking. We have a vote on contingent staking, and the vote passes. We'll also cover the non-pass scenario, but let's say it passes. I think there's only so many. The important thing is there's only so many scenarios that happen here. In a previous video, that can happen here. In a previous video, I explained that nobody should be losing sleep over contingent staking right now because I think there's only so many scenarios that play out here. And that's which of those scenarios we end up in is going to determine everything, and not so much our getting all excited about it right now. So the people who are in favor of contingent staking, at least some of them, part of the reason they're excited about it is because the second we have contingent staking and the stake pool operators can refuse delegation, the argument goes that we could have this wave of mainstream adoption. So mainstream traditional adoption comes in, and we can't predict the size of this. We don't know how many different economic actors might come into the ecosystem. Some of the examples that have been given are, politicians who might want to do some fundraising. Maybe they might want to run a stake pool. Maybe, government-related actors from a specific nation. They might want to come in, run a stake pool just for people in their nation state. And it's understandable why that would be attractive. If we could get a nation state of any size to come in and start doing stake pool stuff, maybe that means an adoption event by the people in the jurisdiction of that nation state, and we would probably welcome that from any nation state of any size. So we can say, and there's a lot of other actors who would not come in and run a stake pool because they're going to ask the question, hey, if I run a stake pool, how do I make sure that nobody from a rogue state like North Korea delegates to my stake pool? Because if the US government finds out about that, if I'm running a stake pool and delegation is coming from, some party in North Korea, I'm going to get in trouble with the US government. This is no good. I can't, take on that liability. So there are probably a lot of different reasons why traditional mainstream economic actors might come in and run a stake pool under contingent staking who wouldn't currently. So we can say there's probably some amount of economic value tied to this mainstream adoption. There's some kind of economic value there. There's some kind of quantifiable amount of volume on the chain that might be related to all of the new staking use cases that would come in with contingent staking. And the idea is if we pass contingent staking, then all this new mainstream adoption, whatever amount it is, and I think it really is unpredictable. I think it's very difficult to predict how big this might be, but whatever amount of mainstream adoption would happen because of contingent staking, it would happen, kind of after we passed contingent staking. Just to be clear, I was not talking about Charles's whiteboard videos when I was talking about the rambling ones where people write a bunch of lists of words and then never actually connect the words conceptually. I actually really enjoy his whiteboard videos, and I find that he does connect all of the different concepts he illustrates graphically in those videos. I won't pretend like that's all there is to the pro contingent staking argument. There's more. They have other arguments, but this is the part I'm going to focus on for this video. So let's talk about the other side now. Let's say this is the point in this scenario where we do pass contingent staking at some point in the near term after SIP 1694, because then we'll have voting. So the other side is that if you do that, then the timeline for something that looks a lot like mandatory KYC is sooner. The idea is that mandatory KYC might happen somewhere like here. We'll say mandatory KYC. Sorry, I'm writing vertically, so it's a little what I write is going to look a little awkward, but I think you get the idea. So the idea is that mandatory KYC, instead of happening back here, it happens sooner. And I'll explain why. But first, let me explain why I think there is no timeline down here where we don't end up with mandatory KYC. The global anti-money laundering net that's sort of been woven by the Western democracies, largely, let's say, is broad, and it's broad and it's deep, right? That's kind of the wrong metric for a net, I know. But let's say it's broad and strong. Like a lot of governmental regulatory energy and a lot of corporate energy has been put into building this net, this anti-money laundering net. They don't want rogue states being able to use economic infrastructure. They don't want human traffickers. They don't want narco traffickers. They don't want terrorists using economic infrastructure. They put a lot of energy into this global anti-money laundering net. And there's not really a timeline where the regulators in the EU and in North America don't come along and say, hey, crypto proof of stake, you guys have gotten bigger. And as you get bigger, we definitely think there's some use of your networks by some of these actors we don't want being able to use economic infrastructure. So we can't exactly have this gaping hole in the global anti-money laundering net. They're not going to allow for this hole where there's no KYC, no anti-money laundering. They're not going to allow for that hole just to get bigger and bigger and bigger. There's a point on the timeline when they come around and they say, they're not going to allow this lack of KYC, this lack of anti-money laundering in crypto proof of stake networks. I think with proof of work, it might be a little bit different. And we'll kind of explain, we'll talk about that difference a little bit later. But let's talk now. So we just discussed why this point out here, this point right here, we just talked about why that definitely happens on the timeline. There's not really a timeline here. There's not really a scenario where we never hit that point. Like they're definitely going to come around to proof of stake networks and say, hey, you stake pool operators, you validators, you must KYC. That's definitely going to happen, I think, at some point on the timeline. There's not a timeline where it never happens. So now, once that's out of the way, now we're discussing whether or not the adoption of contingent staking moves it from here, point number 2, to point number 1, whether it accelerates the timeline for mandatory KYC. So I think it does accelerate the timeline for mandatory KYC. And I think it happens in shades. Here's what I mean. Here's a scenario I'm thinking of. So we've seen recently what the SEC likes to do is like to file complaints against crypto entities. So we saw even in the case of Kraken, where they settled with the SEC, we still saw this filed complaint because the SEC, they want to get some arguments out there. They want to make some statements about what they think is permissible and not permissible in crypto. So we see them saying very bad things for crypto, specifically about custodial staking in that case. We saw the same thing with Do Kwon and Terraform Labs. We see them saying trying to establish some very bad precedents for crypto. And you notice they go for the defendants that are easy to argue against. The defendants who aren't necessarily going to look good and aren't necessarily going to have good arguments to defend themselves, like Do Kwon. Do Kwon is not going to look good to the courts. In the case of Kraken, there were some facts there that I think the SEC probably liked. Like Kraken, according to the complaint, didn't seem to be delegating all of the funds that were deposited to that staking program at Kraken. They also seem to be paying, yields on coins like Bitcoin where there is no actual staking. So some of the yields seemed not to be related, and in other ways too, seemed not to be related to any actual staking that was going on. So we know the SEC, they like to go after defendants who won't have great arguments or might look bad to the court. So if I were to imagine, maybe not the SEC in this case, but regulators who care about money laundering and KYC, I could imagine regulators not going after, if they're going to go after some validators who are validating transactions who they think should be precluded by AML, they're not going to go after validators who I think the regulators are going to choose not to go after the validators who have this excuse. Hey, I can't KYC my delegators because it's not a part of our protocol. I don't think they're going to try to set the precedent with a blockchain like that. I think that they would prefer to first go after validators who don't have that argument, right? And it might not even be Cardano. It might be some other blockchain. Some other blockchain where there's some other bad facts that make that blockchain look bad in the eyes of the court or something like that. But I think if they could choose their defendant, they would probably choose a defendant who doesn't have this argument. I can't, if they're going to go after the validator, I can't KYC my delegators because there's no way to do it. There's no contingent delegation. There's no contingent staking in our protocol. So I actually can't KYC them. They don't want the defendant to have that argument. So they might go after some blockchain that has this same tool for the validators, that has something that looks a lot like contingent staking, where the validators can refuse the delegation, where the validators can say, you must give me KYC data or I'm not going to sign the multisig for you to delegate to my stake pool, the equivalent of the stake pool. So if that were to happen, we could have these shades of mandatory KYC. So we might get a complaint where some big validation group in some of their blockchain settles with the SEC. And part of the fact pattern that the SEC makes a big deal of is the fact that they actually could KYC. If we get something like that in a complaint that's settled even, it's going to have a chilling effect on non-KYC validation, non-KYC delegation in Cardano as well, because all the Cardano stake pools, if they can do KYC, they're going to say, hey, that's just like us. We can't distinguish our case from the complaint the SEC just filed against these guys because we can also force KYC. We're just like them. It would be much harder to distinguish ourselves from a case like that. And I think that kind of case is more likely to be sort of like the precedent setting action that some kind of a regulator would go after. I think they would be just like the regulators who are concerned about KYC. They would have the same kind of strategy that we've seen from the SEC. They would go after if they're going to go after validators, they're going to go after a validator who actually can KYC first. And then they'll go after this more corner case where they actually don't have the tooling to KYC. They'll go after that later. But I think they go after the validator who can KYC first. And then Cardano stake pools are going to look at that precedent and say, whether it's, it's not really a precedent, it's not law if it's just in a complaint that gets settled, but it could even be a complaint that doesn't get settled. Maybe it goes through the courts and the court says, yeah, these guys could KYC. So of course they have to KYC. That, they don't even have that argument. And the court, if that's part of the fact pattern, the court is not going to rule on whether or not the ability to KYC is necessarily pertinent. They might comment on it in dicta, which is not binding precedent. That's just where the court sort of freestyles and mentions like, oh, on the side, by the way, we think this, but it's not really binding precedent if it's just dicta. But the court could not even comment on that. They could just say, hey, no, given this fact pattern, of course you have to KYC your delegators. And that would have an even stronger chilling effect on Cardano stake pools. And I think what you'd see is what we've talked about in previous videos, all of the stake pools in Cardano that are in the jurisdictions that require KYC. So definitely the US, all the US, looks like I lost the battery and the stylus is given out there. All of the US SPOs are going to be faced with a choice. And I think this applies whether mandatory KYC happens at time 1 or time 2. All of the US SPOs, maybe all of the EU SPOs, Canadian SPOs, all the countries where AML is a thing, I think it's going to have this chilling effect on all of them. And then we'll have this sort of flight of US SPOs, and maybe EU, maybe Canada, maybe everywhere else there's AML. We'll have this flight of those stake pool operators, not to other jurisdictions. We talked about in the other video how that's not really a thing. You can't really, as a, say, US citizen, you can't just move to Bali and run your stake pool there and expect for US authorities to be cool with that. They're not going to be cool with that. You're still a US citizen. You're still an EU citizen. If they don't want you doing that, they're not going to let you do that. So we're not going to see a flight to other jurisdictions. We're just going to see a flight from staking. They're just going to quit staking. Then we're left, whether this happens at time 1 or time 2, then we're left with the non-EU, non-US SPOs. So we'll just say, for shorthand, we'll just say non-US SPOs. Non-US. They're left staking because they don't care. If there's no authority compelling KYC in their jurisdiction, they're just going to keep doing business as usual. So there won't be a chilling effect on them because they don't care. They don't have any regulator breathing down their necks. So then we have to make a decision. And here's where we are basically going to get to sort of compare these two things. It's like the value of this mainstream adoption. Is this enough to justify the loss of these SPOs? Because this is likely to affect our Nakamoto coefficient or just our number of stake pools. Maybe it doesn't even change our Nakamoto coefficient, but maybe we go from something like 3,000 stake pools to some other number. You pick the number. What is too few? If we have 1,000 stake pools, are you okay with that? If we have 100 stake pools, 1,500 stake pools, what number is too few? What has hurt our decentralization too much? Maybe you're okay with that number. Maybe you're like, hey, this mainstream adoption over here is so big and it's so good for our ecosystem, and it's creating inclusion of so many additional human beings who can now use our blockchain as a more equal economic playing ground. That's worth it. It was worth it to lose the EU and US SPOs. Maybe we're okay with just the non-US SPOs. Maybe we're okay with them because this justifies it, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe after we lose the EU and US SPOs, we're left with some number of non-US, non-EU, I'll say non-US, non-EU, that maybe the number's too low. Maybe, it's a number that's below the threshold that you're comfortable with. I think this is what actually happens whether we vote yes or no to contingent staking, whether or not we actually get around to having that vote, because that vote can happen. This vote right here, it could happen here. It could happen here also. We could have a contingent staking vote right here. Let's say we don't have it up here. So we don't have mandatory KYC at 1, but let's say the regulators come along and they say, hey, we're sick of this gaping hole in crypto. And even though you don't have an ability to KYC, we're just going to say that non-KYC staking is no good. So you either need to stop You either need to stop with the staking activities or you need to involve some kind of KYC. Then we have this vote down here. This is why I think staking is important, because I think if we had this vote tomorrow, I don't think it would pass. I don't think this vote right here would pass if we had it tomorrow. If we had this vote at this point, after the regulators come in and they just say, hey, we're not cool, regardless of whether you have the ability to KYC your delegators, we're not cool with the way staking is working currently. So you either need to stop this staking nonsense or you need to have some ability to KYC. Then I think the community is a lot more likely to vote in favor of contingent staking. I think this vote is more likely to be a yes than this vote over here. This is why I think timing is so important. One of the big problems right now is that we're actually having the conversation out here. We're having the contingent staking debate and chaos that looks kind of like this. This is the chaos of this debate right now. It's happening out here before we even get to Voltaire, before we even have SIP 1694. That's why there's so much chaos. I think out here, it would be a lot easier for people to sort of make their minds, because then they would know that this is going to happen. Out here, though, it's chaos. Out here, I think it would be a little more certain for people, a little less emotional chaos. Right here is kind of intermediate, because people will know as soon as we get Voltaire in place, people will know that eventually we're going to have a contingent staking vote. Probably there'll be some kind of a SIP proposed, and there probably will be a vote on contingent staking. So there'll be a little bit more certainty by the time we get to here. But I think we do have sort of shades of mandatory, because all the regulators need to do is file a complaint against someone who is validating transaction and has delegators who are either on the OFAC list or, are supposed to be getting excluded from financial infrastructure by the anti-money laundering net. And what we know about OFAC violations is that it wouldn't necessarily just be civil, like in the case of the SEC filing a complaint. It could be more like the tornado cash scenario, where it's actually criminal if they decide that you're sort of intentionally, if you're intentionally running infrastructure to help bad guys evade the sanctions list or other anti-money laundering provisions. It might actually become a criminal thing. So I think the big problem, the reason why we've got this over here, I think the big problem is actually this over here in pink, this chaos. I think the big problem is the timing issue. I think out here over on the end of the timeline, people have a lot more certainty. If they already know that they're going to lose these stake pools, they'll kind of know the number of stake pools we're losing is okay with me. It's still above my threshold, or it's below my threshold. In that case, we wouldn't yet know the size of this. We wouldn't yet know the value of the mainstream adoption that would take place after the contingent staking, but we would kind of have some certainty that we would be losing these SPOs. So I think timing is sort of the missing ingredient in this whole contingent staking debate right now. Here are the points I'm trying to get across. It's unclear to me, when the rubber hits the road, whether we'll value this more, the existence of EU and US SPOs more, or whatever amount of mainstream adoption comes from something like having contingent staking. I think there are conceivable scenarios. There are possible scenarios, not necessarily probable, but conceivable scenarios where, let's say, all of the EU and US SPOs have to drop out, which they certainly wouldn't be happy with. I think you'll see very few US or EU SPOs saying that this would be okay because it's against their self-interest. But let's say it happens. Let's say they all have to drop out, and we end up with a bunch of non-US, non-EU zone validators stepping up, starting new stake pools. And we end up with the scenario that Bitcoin was in for a long time. For a long time, the vast majority of the validation in the Bitcoin network was happening in China. And Bitcoin was just fine. We could end up, it's conceivable we end up in a similar situation where we have a ton of non-US, non-EU zone validators, and we're okay with it, just like Bitcoin was. And maybe that's because it turns out this mainstream adoption is huge. And we just decide, hey, you know what? We can't have EU or US SPOs. That's just fine. We'll have non-US, non-EU zone SPOs. And maybe we also decide we don't want contingent staking. Maybe we decide contingent staking is something the community is always going to reject. So we just end up with these non-US, non-EU zone SPOs. But to be clear, there's also a scenario where we do have contingent staking and a lot of the EU, US SPOs still drop out because just having KYC information may not be enough. Like I've described in previous videos, financial infrastructure service providers in the US at least, they don't just have to collect KYC data from their customers. They often, and it's obviously a complex, regulatory regime, but in a lot of cases, they have to have whole AML functions, like whole departments of people who just do AML compliance stuff. Obviously, EU and US SPOs, they're not trying to hire on AML compliance people to help run their stake pools. At least, I can't imagine a huge proportion of the current stake pools would be willing to do that. The economics just don't currently work out. Maybe they do in the future. And that's where it goes. But currently, the way the economics work with the stake pool, I can't imagine stake pools having these AML compliance personnel on hand. The economics just wouldn't justify it. But the other important thing is that the how this mandatory KYC timeline gets sped up with contingent staking, I think it has more to do with this sort of shades of mandatory thing where we see regulators doing what regulators normally do, and that's choosing the easy fact pattern. And I think the easy fact pattern here is a blockchain where the validators can demand KYC from their delegators. It's like if I'm a regulator and I'm strategizing, going after KYC in staking, I'm not going to choose the block. My precedent setting case is not going to be the blockchain where the validators can't even do KYC. I'm going to choose the easy fact pattern where they can do KYC. And maybe it's not even Cardano. Maybe it's some other blockchain. But if that precedent, and I think the precedent is going to be the easy fact pattern where they can do KYC. If that's the case, if that's the precedent setting case, Cardano won't be able to distinguish itself from that case if we also have contingent staking. So I think that explains the how we get from contingent staking to everybody ends up in this mandatory KYC bucket is if we have this precedent from the regulators that says, hey, here's this fact pattern, validators in this blockchain could KYC. So we're going to say they have to KYC, and I think they do choose that easy fact pattern. I could be wrong, but I think it's there's a good probability they choose that easy fact pattern. If that happens, then we wouldn't be able to distinguish the fact pattern in Cardano as easily from that precedent-setting case. It wouldn't be like Coinbase writing that rebuttal article where they attempted to distinguish their staking program from that of Kraken. It would be more like if Coinbase was exactly like Kraken. They wouldn't be able to distinguish themselves from the fact pattern of Kraken. So I think in my mind, that explains at least part of the how people have been asking about. People have been asking, how do we go from contingent staking to all of a sudden we're in mandatory KYC? All it takes is one precedent setting case from the regulators who care about KYC and AML. And, true, we could get this too. We could get nothing until we get to this two timeline, time two, where they just come along and they say, okay, all staking, we're going to require KYC. That could happen too, in which case it wouldn't matter if we passed contingent staking before or after. It just kind of happens now. But I think regulators do what regulators do, and they tend to choose easy fact patterns. And I think the fact pattern where you can KYC your delegators is the easy fact pattern they choose. And if that's the case, then us already having contingent staking means we can't distinguish our fact pattern from that fact pattern. I hope everybody is having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.